Welcome to the second part of the EventSentry installation training. In the first part, we covered the main installation routine, and now we're going to be focusing on the configuration assistant. So after the first part of the installation concludes, the configuration assistant is going to be automatically loaded, and you'll see this dialog here. Once we hit next, the first question that we are presented with is whether to enable email alerts or not. If you want to get email alerts, we'll leave this checked, and then we can decide what volume level you're interested in receiving and any sort of limits you want to impose. Everything that's configured here, and that's important to iterate, can of course be changed later in the management console. So this is just an initial setup. The default setting is low, and that will essentially send you almost no email alerts. And that's preferred by a lot of people because some monitoring software can be pretty noisy. It will still set up your email action in EventSentry, and you can test it, and you're ready to manually specify which alerts you want to receive, but by default you won't really be getting any alerts. Medium gives you the option to decide what type of emails you want to receive. Again, this can still be fairly noisy depending on your systems, how many systems you have, and so forth. And high will obviously generate the most alerts. This will enable all categories automatically. You will not be able to choose in this case. But it is arguably a slightly more secure method of getting alerts, but also the most time intensive because you'll have to be manually configuring EventSentry and excluding what's probably going to be a lot of noise, especially from the security event log. And on the bottom, you can also limit how many emails you'll be receiving at max per hour. So in this particular case with this setting, you will not be getting more than 10 emails per hour, regardless of the setting and regardless of many alerts you would be receiving. So if we hit next here, we're ready to specify the SMTP server. If we select medium and click next, then we have the option of selecting what type of alerts we want to receive. Automatically checked here are EventSentry alerts. So that would include anything EventSentry detects to be wrong with the system, such as disk space alerts, performance alerts, services changing their status, things like that. Generic system alerts, on the other hand, would be errors and warnings coming from the application or system event log. And audit failures, that's like I explained just earlier, the most noisy would be audit failures from the security event log. So I'll just enable those two. Click next. So now we're at the SMTP server dialog. So here you'll want to specify your SMTP server, port, whether to use TLS, authentication of course, and you can also click the test button to see if it was successful. So I'll enter our mail server here. I hit the test button and we'll get an OK message back. Finally, the default recipient. You can of course add multiple recipients in EventSentry. You can also change this later, but this will be the default recipient that's being set up as part of the initial configuration. So I set up some test recipients here and click next. Now, since we did choose to install a database, we're being asked about the passwords for the default users. So EventSentry installs two SQL users by default, one which is being used by the agents and the collector. So this account primarily writes data to the database. And then we have the web user for the reporting engine that primarily reads data. So the abilities of these user accounts are different, and they've been split up for security reasons. It's usually best to just hit the generate button and create a default password, and then save the configuration here, save the passwords in a file for later reference. So you can go to the desktop here and just call this ES SQL users, and then we can move on from here. In most cases, you won't want to leave and store the data in the database forever. So by default, EventSentry will configure a purge job and delete data every day that is older than the specified number of days. So this job here by default runs at 11 p.m. And keeps 30 days of data. This can of course be changed to whatever you'd like. In this dialog here, it's hard-coded, but once you have EventSentry installed, you can set this to 100 days, 110 days, 12 days, whatever. The max database size is for warnings only. So we're not limiting, and we cannot limit the database size. Once the database reaches this size, it will generate a warning in EventSentry that the database size has been reached. So we'll make this a little bit bigger here. We'll set this to 50 gigabytes. Now we're being asked about the heartbeat monitoring component. So this component essentially verifies the connectivity of remote devices, which would include domain controllers, servers, workstation if you'd want to, and any sort of network device. And the heartbeat monitor will also talk to network devices using the SMTP protocol. So we're going to enable this. By default, the heartbeat agent runs under the local system account, and that's the preferred option, especially if you're going with the collector, which is enabled by default. If you're not using the collector and you want the heartbeat service to directly access the remote agents and verify that the EventSentry service is running, then you'll have to put in a service account here that has administrative rights on those remote computers. Going with the local system is generally the easier option and works just as well with the collector. Network services receive mostly data from network devices such as syslog, logs, SMTP traps, and NetFlow data. We're going to enable this as well. And then finally, we're here with the collector. So the collector is that proxy service that sits between the agents and some of the components and the database. If you're unfamiliar with these components like heartbeat, network services, and collector, there's another video that outlines and explains all the EventSentry components. I'd recommend take a look at that. But yeah, we're going to enable the collector here. And finally, the AdMonitor component. So that monitors Active Directory. Once you enable this component, you'll have to either specify a user account with domain administrative rights, or since this account already exists, here we're prompted to put in the password of that user account, and of course clicking the test button will verify that password. We're also getting a warning here that we don't have an AdMonitor license installed here. So if you're getting that warning, that means you don't have a license. The EventSentry evaluation version does include the AdMonitor license. So if you're evaluating, you don't have to worry about licenses. They're all included. But if you purchased EventSentry and you're getting this warning, that means you didn't purchase the AdMonitor licenses. So we're not going to enable this component now. It makes no difference for the purpose of this video. Once here at the very end, we're getting a summary as everything that's being set up. So we're creating the email action, we're setting up the database, and we're configuring all these three components that we just enabled. Now we're going to click Next. EventSentry is now guessing or trying to determine the performance of the disk where the EventSentry database is going to be installed. This usually takes about 30 seconds or so. If the disk is too slow, which on this system it likely will be, you're going to get a warning message recommending that you install the database on a faster system. And that's important because if the disk speed, the disk performance is too low and you're sending too much data from too many agents to EventSentry, then you could run into issues with the reporting being slow or with the collector simply not being able to store all the data that's being received in a database in a timely fashion. And here we are. So we're getting the warning message telling us that the disk may not be sufficiently fast. The installation does continue, and it will likely work. So if you're just evaluating or if you have a very small network, it may work just fine. But this is just something that points out that this is something that you need to keep an eye on this, and that this may not be the best hardware for a larger EventSentry installation. So there's a KB article that automatically launches. We're going to close that. And now we can watch the configuration assistant work its way through the process, creating all the tables, indexes, enabling all the components, and so forth. And voila, this is what we're getting. when the process is complete, we're just going to click finish here and wait for the EventSentry Management Console to open. And that's it. EventSentry is installed on this system.